Let me introduce Dirk. We all know who Dirk is, but Dirk will be discussing and defending his dissertation for the Department of Comparative Studies and Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature today. And let me get the title correct here before I don't get it right. So the title of Dirk's dissertation is Dialectic of Neoliberalism, the Shape of Debt. So we'll start the discussion with Dirk giving some comments, and then we'll open it up for questions. And after a bit of time, we will retire to the committee discussion and ask others to leave us to that. So Dirk, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to Annapala and Tony and Robin, my committee. I'd like to start with a few short acknowledgements. First, I actually want to acknowledge the pandemic and the displacement that it has caused for all of us. I would much rather be in a room together with all of you, but in that spirit, I sincerely welcome you to my home. I acknowledge that the University of Minnesota stands on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate. These words matter to me, especially because of my research into the University of Minnesota's budget history. The University of Minnesota was built and continues to operate on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1805, 1837, and 1851, among others. These treaties remain legally contested. The University of Minnesota continues to receive annual revenues from resources from the remaining 25,840 acres of Morrill Act lands and an additional 22,028 acres of associated mineral rights managed by the state of Minnesota. Due to a predetermined stipulation on land gifted to the state by the federal government, the Morris campus remains the only University of Minnesota campus that grants tuition waivers to Native students. I acknowledge that these acknowledgements are not enough, and I call on the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota to entreat tribal leaders to engage in discussions to determine appropriate treaty renegotiations, reparations, and/or repatriation of land occupied and resourced by the University of Minnesota. Wow. This work is dedicated to my son, Cade, who is here with us today, and to Barb, and to Robin. You are my greatest teachers, and I sincerely thank you for your patience and support and guidance. Thank you. So, dialectic of neoliberalism, the shape of debt. Dialectic of neoliberalism, the shape of debt. My work begins with my own struggle to understand the complicated concept of dialectic. The simplest way to understand dialectic is by comparing it to rhetoric, as Aristotle did. We each have a working concept of what rhetoric is, even if we are not presently aware of it as consumers of Western culture. Rhetoric is the language used by our politicians and news media outlets to convince us to see things from their point of view and ultimately to vote according to their desires. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Dialectic has a very similar structure, but it is bound by truth. Rhetoricians appeal to logic, emotions, and ethics to convince us of a certain point of view. Dialecticians also want to convince us of a certain point of view, but they are not willing to sacrifice their perception of truth in order to do so. This work relies on my interpretation of Theodor Adorno's negative dialectics. Adorno realized accurately that any concept of truth is already influenced by culture. He effectively argued that there is no such thing as the concept of truth because any idea that we have of truth is already influenced by our upbringing, our education, religion, etc. Negative dialectics is a framework that helps us see that everything we think we know to be true is something arbitrarily taught to us through our culture. And it is therefore a tool that can be used to identify the structures of power that uphold those beliefs. Using negative dialectics as a tool to look for power, I started to look at my own life to identify the places where I felt it. As a graduate student nearing the end of my formal education, naturally, I've been in school for a number of years and have collected the statistically average amount of student debt along the way. I noticed that dutifully paying the monthly dues required by my loan servicing plan barely put a dent in my high interest bearing loans. After nearly 10 years of payments amounting to over $20,000, I still owe $25,000, roughly 71% of my total loan amount, and I've paid nearly as much interest as principal. Something here is very wrong. So I got curious. I started crunching the numbers and researching the predatory practices involved with student loan lending and servicing. I began to question the narratives I experienced growing up. I was expected to go to college, and it was assumed that I would take out loans to fund my education because a college education would more than pay for school loans. And the alternative was what I heard from trusted adults and unwitting peers alike. What, you don't want to get stuck flipping burgers your whole life, do you? The more I looked, the more I found that the policies put in place by the US government for the student loan industry were influenced by a certain set of beliefs that have pervaded our economic, political, and social culture, beliefs best defined by the concept of neoliberalism. In short, neoliberalism, loosely defined by Philip Mirowski in The Road from Mont Pelerin, consists of a laissez-faire-like free market economy, deregulation, and a religious-like zeal for liberty and individualism. A dialectic of neoliberalism then refers to an investigation into the power structures that inform these ideas. Dialectic of neoliberalism, the shape of debt, uses student debt as an object of that investigation to understand how the neoliberal project has succeeded in influencing the creation of a student debt market that embodies the neoliberal ideals of the free market, deregulation, and individualism. This is the substance of the first 3 chapters of the dissertation and the method I used to investigate student debt. I'd like to share an insight from that work. In order to understand neoliberalism, I felt I needed to understand its history and development, which led me to read John Locke's second treatise, and to think about its influence on the ideas that came to be known as classical liberalism and its influence on the founding of the American government. I became particularly interested in the classical liberal interpretation of liberty and property, especially as they appear in the early documents related to the founding of the United States of America. It's clear to me that the classical liberal idea of property rights in particular was fundamental to the design of the American government from the very beginning. It's baked in. Locke wrote, "The great and chief end of men's uniting to commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property." Combined with the radical individualism that has made its way into our culture via classical liberalism, it is no wonder to me why the concept of property plays such an important role in the American ethos. To me, it feels like we value property even more than our own humanity. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have such a hard time addressing the student debt crisis. We hear things like, students knew what they were doing when they got themselves into this, or I had to pay off my student loans, or why should they receive a government handout from my taxes? Moving on. As recently as 2 weeks ago, CNBC published a news story that attributed the student debt crisis to deep cuts in state funding for higher education, which paved the way for significant tuition increases and pushed more of the costs of college onto students. When I turned to researching student debt, I started with this common knowledge that the student debt crisis is a result of state governments defunding colleges and universities, which in turn required universities to increase tuition in order to cover their operating costs. I wanted to know if this was actually true. So, in addition to being a graduate student, I work full-time at the College of Liberal Arts. And so I used my resources to start looking at the University of Minnesota's budget documents. I met with the university's budget director and got a crash course on how to read these complicated documents. And I met with the university archivist who helped me track down all of the budget documents for the University of Minnesota, going all the way back to its founding in 1851. Thanks in part to this research, the University of Minnesota now has a complete set of electronic annual budget documents available in the university archives. When I first started reading the documents, it became very clear to me that there were 2 types of reports. One, the early budget reports, roughly the first 60 years, consisted largely of narratives about the university with budget numbers interspersed throughout. And the second type, since the establishment of the Office of the Comptroller in 1912, there's been a separate budget report that's remained relatively consistent for roughly the last 100 years. The narrative budget reports are beautiful. They are full of wonderful examples of university presidents praising school and the state and the students in ways that really demonstrate a genuinely symbiotic relationship. The early budget reports also tell a fascinating history of the growth of the university in terms of its buildings, programs, and enrollments. I think it's actually pretty cool. The university adopted a standardized accounting system in 1921, and just as you might expect, Budget reports became very dry and largely limited to factual accounting. While not that much fun to read, this made it pretty easy to isolate the same categories of revenue that are still accounted for in the university's current budget documents today. It also made a natural starting point for looking at the data that I used to compare state allocations to tuition and fees. And here's what I found. Steve, would you please put up figure K?
Yeah.
Thank you. So this graph is the real product of my research. Moving from left to right, we see that both state allocations and tuition and fees remained relatively flat with steady gains until the 1940s, when soldiers returning from World War II started attending the university on the GI Bill and changed the financial landscape of the university. Since then, we see steady rises in both state allocations and tuition and fees. And state allocations are a much larger portion of the university's total revenues than tuition dollars through the 20th century. The dip in state allocations between 1980 and 2000 coincides with the closing of the University of Minnesota Waseca campus in 1992.
Yeah.
The relationship between state allocations and tuition and fees shifted dramatically with the steep budget cuts to higher education in Minnesota introduced as part of Governor Tim Paletti's 2004-2005 higher education budget bill. During the same period, the university increased tuition by double-digit percentages multiple times, with an average of 9.6% increase per year during the decade spanning 2001-2010. It wasn't until budget cuts associated with the Great Recession took place at the end of that decade that tuition and fees became a larger source of revenue for the university than state allocations. Now, I don't have my degree just yet, and I'm still an employee at the University of Minnesota, so I draw my conclusions very conservatively. But there are still a couple of interesting things that I read from this, especially considering enrollments during the same period. Number one, aside from three distinct historical events, the closing of the Waseca campus in 1992, TPAW's budget cuts in 2004-2005, and the Great Recession, in terms of dollar amounts, the state of Minnesota has consistently raised its level of support year after year. So the story that states are decreasing allocations isn't necessarily true, at least not for the University of Minnesota. It is certainly true in terms of percentages of total revenues, but not actual dollars allocated from the state. Steve, would you please put up figure N? Thank you. Here we see historical student headcounts going from 1870 to the present day. In the middle, we see a large blip that accounts for the GIs in the 1940s. Other than that, we see a dip in the 1980s that was the result of President Keller's commitment to focus initiative. And we see a significant increase in the 1990s, but that was just when the university began including enrollment numbers from the College of Continuing Education. So if we consider those as outliers, what we actually see is a relatively flat period of enrollment during the same period when tuition revenues increased so dramatically in the 21st century. The result is that dollar per student ratio funded by tuition dollars is actually decreasing at the same time we see such stark increases in tuition. Thank you, Steve. So returning to Murawski's definition of neoliberalism as according to free markets, deregulation, and individualism, and using Josh Mitchell's historical research on the American student loan industry in The Debt Trap, How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe, the student loan industry is an example of how neoliberal ideas have become perverted in action. Beginning with the Guaranteed Student Loan Program of 1958 and carrying through the 1965 Higher Education Act, President Clinton's direct loan program, and the Great Recession, where Sallie Mae, the federal government's version of the Federal Housing Administration for student loans, became the first bailout of the 2008 financial crisis. The student debt industry has benefited from a market that was built to insulate banks and lenders at the expense of student borrowers and American taxpayers. Politically, higher education became an American priority following the 1957 launch of Sputnik, but banks were unwilling to accept the financial reality of high interest rates without certain protections put in place. Long story short, Those protections amounted to government regulations such that the federal government subsidized interest rates and loan defaults to the point that Sallie Mae was able to operate virtually risk-free, again, at the expense of student borrowers and American taxpayers. Paired with the rhetoric of individualism, that each student is responsible for their own actions, the federal government created an artificial market, one that is heavily regulated in favor of the banks. For example, student loans are ineligible for bankruptcy claims. And it's one that relies on neoliberal individualism to place the responsibility for student debt squarely on the students themselves. I conclude the dissertation with a meditation on a theory of debt that captures its historical physical brutality and psychological abuse and exposes the perverse power dynamic that underlies student debt relationships and debt relationships in general. This dialectic of debt reveals a power at play that at times has imposed the most heinous physical tortures, psychological torments, and perverse applications of power itself in order to maintain class antagonisms. Thus, the implication that student debtors deserve their punishment is in direct conflict with the structures that have directly contributed to the problem. Using historical theories of debt put forth by Hume, Nietzsche, and Deleuze and Guattari, this project reaches the ultimate conclusion that the shape of debt is rooted in a profound violence and desire to exert power and control over other human beings. This project further concludes that the shape of debt indicates one example of the ways in which human beings value capital and power over life and humanity itself. There is one more thing that I'd like to share with you about this work. As I was researching debt and neoliberalism, I started thinking about the role that money and politics play in the American student debt industry. As Mitchell reported in The Debt Trap, which was a surprise to me, academia employs more lobbyists than any other industry except pharmaceuticals and big tech, the two industries most dependent on marketing addiction as a business model. I found that neoliberal ideals were disproportionately represented in the philosophies adopted by the majority of think tanks that were influencing Washington. And I started to wonder how difficult it would be to create an entity that operated according to a different set of values. So again, I got curious. And long story short, the Debt Policy Institute, or DPI, opened for business in January of 2020. DPI is a 501c3 nonprofit public charity dedicated to ending student loan debt. DPI is the practical wing of the research and theoretical framework set forth in Dialectic of Neoliberalism, The Shape of Debt, where we believe that helping students towards financial independence and economic prosperity benefits all Americans, and we're soliciting financial donations to address the economic disparities that have resulted from the student debt crisis. Thank you very much.